Welcome back to Defence Talks, Securing UK Advantage, a podcast brought to you by the Council on Geostrategy in partnership with trade association ADS Group and sponsored by industry powerhouse BAE Systems. This season, we continue to explore the key questions that shape defence, technological and national security agendas in the UK and unpack the main themes in British defence in the context of intensifying geopolitical competition. I'm Viktorija, Starych-Samuolienė, co-founder at the Council on Geostrategy, and as always, I'm joined by Paul Mason.
Well, hello, Victoria, and what a time to be talking about defence. Everything's changing as we speak. I think we were all just checking our message feeds as we came on air, what's going on. We've got the government now using the word rearmament, and that took them a long time to get around to, but they're doing it enthusiastically. In the spring statement, 2.2 billion extra, which brings an extra 5 billion to the defence budget since the budget. And I think anyone close to Whitehall, anyone close to the Ministry of Defence knows that even though the public don't quite get it yet, everything has changed about the way we are going to have to react to the world. So I don't know about you, but I'm running to keep up with where we are, and that's with Britain alone. The world picture that we'll discuss with our guests in a minute is also changing rapidly.
We're in the same boat, Paul, and I have to say, well, given the global developments we are witnessing, including what's happening in the US, the Ukraine talks in Saudi Arabia, also the instability in the Middle East and the Red Sea, there's just so much to talk about today, and we are absolutely delighted to be joined by Iain Martin and Dr. Hilary Briffa, who I will introduce shortly. So, Iain Martin is the director of the London Defence Conference, and he is also the director of Engelsberg Ideas for the excellent Margaret Axon Johnson Foundation. He had a long career in newspapers, editing The Scotsman and working as a senior executive and columnist on titles including The Times, The Wall Street Journal and The Daily Telegraph. He is also an award-winning golfer. And we also have with us today Dr. Hilary Briffa from King's College London, who is a senior lecturer in National Security Studies and the assistant director of the Centre for Defence Studies in the Department of War Studies at King's College London. She is on the editorial board of open access peer-reviewed Small States and Territorial Journal and regularly consults on foreign policy and defence issues for the British government and international governments, ranging from Estonia to Fiji. She is also our associate fellow, and I believe that she's on the organising committee of the London Defence Conference.
Absolutely, yeah.
Wonderful. So, Paul, well, perhaps let's crack on. Spring statement.
Yes. No, in the kind of general news arena, the spring statement has made headlines for welfare cuts and rows, etc., over public spending, austerity. But for defence, it's the beginning, I think, of a boom for defence spending. We've had, as I said before, now a total of 5 billion added to the defence budget. For the cynic, one might ask how much of that is covering an in-year overspend, because there is always an in-year overspend at MOD. But there's some very interesting things like a new Defence Innovation Unit, model on the American Defence Innovation Unit in the DoD. We've got 2 billion extra of export finance, aiming to reach 10 billion, specifically earmarked for defence. And then what's really interesting to me is that the government's put something like 10% of the MOD's budget into a ring-fenced pot to spend on innovation. It's 10% of the equipment budget on innovation. So that is everything from drones, AI, EMS, electromagnetic spectrum, everything. And it kind of betokens to me that because you don't get to do things like that unless the Treasury let you do them, that there is a recognition across Whitehall and across government that they have to now really take seriously the task of rearmament and getting ahead of on the technological curve. And Iain, I was going to come to you first and say, what's your take on what is driving government to this new urgency? And you too, Hilary, is it going to be enough?
Well, no, I don't think it's going to be enough, and I think they're going to have to come back and do this several times more, such as the gravity and the urgency of the situation. However, I would characterise it as, I wouldn't go as far as to say that the Treasury is no longer in charge, but the Treasury is not driving this. The world has changed, in Rachel Reeves' terms, in the last 3-4 months. But the Treasury 3 or 4 months ago was accused of being by some people in government of being almost a blocking mechanism and just not understanding the extent to which the world had changed, while defence and people in and outside government had been waving the red flag, saying the country has to wake up. What's changed is the election of Donald Trump and the inauguration, how fast things are moving since then, and defence really being vindicated. Now, Treasury, of course, will still have a lot of control over how money's spent, but the dynamic has changed, and it's also to do with the elevation of Keir Starmer, whose stature has developed and risen in the months since the budget because of his actions on the international stage and the Chancellor being under pressure. So a lot of change in Whitehall, though on the surface everyone will deny that, and it's all about politesse, but and manners. But really, the Treasury is not in the driving seat,
and it kind of challenges the defence community to answer the question: well, what is it that you want? That's been sort of hived off to the SDR for quite a while. We've got the defence industrial strategy still being undertaken. Some of the detail on the Defence Innovation Unit is not there. So with this new focus on defence, Hilary, I was going to say to you, what's your take on the overall situation, and how does it look to you? How do the challenges stack up for the UK defence community?
So I agree with Iain and with everybody else that I think this is a step in the right direction, and it's been a long time coming. I mean, there's been accusations of sort of sleepwalking into crisis because of so many years of steady cuts while priorities were elsewhere. So I definitely think the increase in funding is a positive move. I think what we're going to need is really good evaluation and assessment on what we're spending on, because there can be a tendency sometimes to go the other way and to have a bit of a shopping spree. But we have to make sure we're going to be able to evaluate whether we are spending in the right areas and the impact. Obviously, as an academic, I'm in favour of study and making sure things are being evaluated properly. But I think that it's a step in the right direction, both for defence itself, but for the wider economy. I think we can see that defence can be a positive motivator for an uplift in economic development and development of technologies that we use every day. We wouldn't have radar or computers or many of the things we use in our day-to-day life if it wasn't for investment in defence. But I also don't think that's enough either. And the Council on Geostrategy has this great series called The Big Ask, where each week they ask experts a question to think about. And last week I was asked to think about this investment in defence and the economy. And I said we also need to think about this using a third metric, which is sustainability, and making sure that our investment in defence is also going into thinking about the aspects of our defence estate, of our logistics, of our procurement in a way that aligns with sustainability goals. Because for every, you can create 7 green jobs for every 2 jobs in fossil fuel industries. And so I think there's this cycle where they can all reinforce each other, but we can't be looking at each of the pieces in isolation.
Iain, you run the London Defence Conference, and of course we will get to the upcoming iteration of it in a moment. But I recall I attended the London Defence Conference Investment Forum back in December, and the topic of that forum last year was defence as an engine for growth. Do you think we can clearly state that the government sees the defence industry as an engine for growth?
Yes, that's the big change. It's really defence and resilience and dual use is at the heart of how they're seeing things. And this transfer of power that I described, the Treasury becoming less powerful and number 10 becoming more powerful, is very clearly grasped in number 10, that defence and resilience are a big part of the future. I mean, we've founded that investment forum very much with, it's a companion to, we'll talk about the London Defence Conference later, but it's a companion, but driven by this idea that you need the private sector. It's not only the government. The government, of course, delivers so much of taxpayers' money to defence, but the scale of what's going to be required in the next 10, 20, 30 years in terms of new technology, R&D, is going to require the leverage of huge amounts of private capital as well, working in concert with government. So we founded that really to try and get government, the city, investors, just to begin a conversation about defence when we all know for the last, as long as I can remember, defence has been put on the naughty step or kind of put alongside tobacco and fossil fuels, and the situation always struck me as crazy a few years ago, but particularly crazy now. So it was an attempt to begin a conversation about that.
I think earlier this month there were over 100 MPs who actually signed a letter calling British financial institutions to class UK defence investments as ethical. Perhaps we can touch a bit more on the ESG and the issues the defence industry has encountered in recent years because of that.
Yeah, I mean, I thought that was a terrific development. There was some sort of sense that it might have been partly coordinated by the Treasury, because the Treasury, having taken a very traditional view that defence is not a multiplier, right? That defence is one for one, that it doesn't bring you anything else, to which down the decades I've had discussions with people from the Treasury about this, and I've said that makes sense if you completely ignore the Manhattan Project and ARPA and DARPA and what happened with defence in the United States in the 1950s and 1960s. Apart from that, is a great argument, but that now seems to be, on the back burner. I mean, I take a slightly different view from Hillary on the ESG side of it. I know it's a very big thing for industry, and I understand the intentions behind it. Understand the importance of clean energy. I tend to think some of that will have to be dialed down in the coming decades. Such is the need for defence industrial production at speed, and that is going to require cheap energy, not in 10 or 15 years' time, but like now. So I don't have the answer to that. I know it's a hot topic, and some people are worried about dialing down on the kind of ESG side of things. But I think we need more of everything, and energy is going to be a big part of it.
But I think the challenge comes if we start to present them as binaries, that we can, think about sustainability and climate action and so on, or we can think about defence. And it's absolutely not the case, because we can be thinking, defence is, for example, 50% of the UK emissions are coming from government emissions come from defence. But we can think about the estate, we can think about the supply chains, because otherwise we risk that our defence responses are going to be two problems that are being caused by emissions elsewhere. But also, more generally, if we look at, the point is we have to be in defence, we have to be resilient, we have to be operationally effective and so on. So the question is, where can we think about sustainability efforts in a way that will enhance those practices and not detract, and be thinking about the two together? But if we put them both in separate boxes and we're not having those conversations and thinking about the defence industrial supply chains, the procurement processes, and the whole approach together, that is where then I'm quite worried when we make it an either or. And that's where there's new research and exciting research being done looking at defence industrial strategy, but different aspects of the defence process. There's a really good centre in Loughborough, there are good centres in Manchester, where they're really trying to think about the new direction and the new way of trying to look at both and not separate the two.
I think all disciplines that are adjacent to defence, including investment, are right now in a process of rapid change. We were at a conference last Friday where it was Chatham House rules, so I can't say who said this, but there was an interesting point made about most people studying, for example, nuclear in nuclear policy. Not nuclear energy, but nuclear defence policy in universities are currently studying disarmament. The whole frame has been disarmament. I know the person who said this was an academic and said, look, we're going to have to pretty rapidly change this to a different thing, i.e. rearmament. And a whole set of academics are going to have to get their head around doing the opposite of what they've been teaching.
It's a really, really interesting point, Paul, because I think back to, I'm reminded there of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and I was an undergraduate, and politics was part of my course. And I remember, Berlin Wall falls, and then coming back after Christmas and various revolutions are happening, and thinking, good Lord, they're going to have to completely change the syllabus here, because so much of what we thought about the Cold War and about politics and philosophy has just been blown up. And of course, that didn't happen because these things take time to adjust. And I think, it's a transformation on that scale. We're going to need people to think about things in a completely different way.
And while we're on the issue of access to finance, do either of you think ESG is the main obstacle? Or because we're both veterans of Iain, of the financial crisis 2008, and there's a view in industry that it's, especially among SMEs and MEs, it's not ESG so much as the general risk aversion of capital post 2008, post Basel II, Basel III. How does that play for either of you?
I mean, I think it's a whole other podcast, and it takes us beyond defence. I mean, I think in our response to the financial crisis, I think we kind of broke our system, and we embedded risk aversion for understandable reasons, because we're all furious about what happened in the financial crisis. So the motives were understandable and positive. I think there's that, plus then a little bit more that attaches to defence. So it's risk aversion, plus just a cultural assumption that since the 1990s that we're just living in a globalized world of ever freer trade and open capital markets, and then the green movement on top of that as well. But so there's a bigger, broader point about the failure of our capital markets that needs addressed.
I think there's reputational aspects when it comes to investors choosing what they're going to put their money into. I think Iain's right that defence hasn't naturally been the first choice. But also I think some of the structures and processes need improving. I mean, I do a lot of work on small states, and so you have a place like Estonia that has the most unicorns per capita in the world, which is sort of these new companies that are startups and trying to make things work. But in any situation where you have startups, even here in the UK, it's very difficult to get the right investment to be able to do to scale up, to plan long term. Most defence development takes much longer than the procurement cycles of government. If you're telling people, well, you can apply for funding year on year, that makes it very difficult. And I think we crowd out a lot of innovation and new players in the game because they do not have that support and backing. And we definitely need just new ways of making it faster, and to say also the government will take on some of that risk to be able to plan more long term.
But I think, to be positive for a second, things are changing, and things have changed a hell of a lot in the last even 3 or 4 months, in that people are prepared to speak in public, or it's a bit, tentative initially, but it's a dramatically different situation. I mean, businesses who listen to this some might tell us different, and might still be hitting up against the reluctance of capital. But I notice an enormous change in the last couple of years, which is people grasping that this is not just a blip. This is a major rethink, and that's going to endure for the next 10, 20, 30 years in terms of how we structure our societies and economies.
Given what you've just said, Iain, Hilary, I'd actually like to ask you about the attitudes among young people on defence. So you're a senior lecturer at King's College London, and we do have some interesting stats here, and I'll quote a couple of numbers. 90% of young Europeans are unable to name a single private defence company. So these stats are from the report by Centre for the Governance of Change at IE University and Airbus Defence and Space. Then most young Europeans associate the defence industry to military technology, vehicles and electronics, but less than a fifth of respondents link it to research and development or telecommunications and networking. So that's from a report by Centre for the Governance of Change at IE University. It's the same source. And then from the same source, at least a fifth of young people in Western Europe do not think companies in the defence sector are committed to peace and conflict resolution, protecting democracy, or the fight against climate change. What's your view on this issue?
Sure. Well, I think over time we've had a broadening of our understanding of national security, right? That it's not just about military threats. And for a lot of young people today, they have grown up in a context, not everybody, but many have grown up, at least in the UK, in a context of relative peace. And so the issues that have occupied their concern would be things like the climate crisis, like human security issues. More recently, the conflict in Gaza and Ukraine, bringing suddenly more traditional defense back into the awareness and the consciousness of a lot of young people, but their focus is more on the impact of new technology, on cyber. And so I think the issue is not that they don't care about what's going on in the world, but that we need to find ways to show that defense also speaks to these things that these groups of young people care about and are interested, because they are more likely to be, thinking about things in terms of how does the world align with my values and the things that I want to stand up for. And so I'd say the biggest challenges are perception and access. I mean, most people grow up saying, I want to be an astronaut or a lawyer or a doctor. They don't normally grow up thinking, I want to work for a defense company, because most people don't grow up knowing about defense companies, what they do, which then leaves you open to misperception, just lack of knowledge about what companies do, what they're involved in, that this is a viable route for those interested in both STEM careers and policy careers. And we went to last year's Defence Investment Forum, and I took some of my MA students, and there was a little bit of a disconnect between those on the stage saying, we want to engage young people, and then the young people in the audience saying, well, how do we do it? How do we get our internship? How do we get our conversation with them? And so I think one thing we're really trying to do is think about how can we bring these two worlds together. And the last thing I'll say is, whilst I'm talking about mostly those kinds of young people who aren't already thinking about defense, there is, of course, a whole group of young people who are, those who are conscripted, those who have a military background, or generally young people who do their military service. In many countries around Europe, there is conscription, there's a compulsory military service. So many people grow up with this greater consciousness of the work of the military. And so I think that we need to, and they care very deeply about defense. So I think we need to find a way to open the doors and make things a bit more transparent, and exactly to use the word that Iain used before, to have a conversation about what the work of defense is and how it can actually, by safeguarding our more traditional security threats, we can also be making progress towards making sure people live in peaceful societies where their human security needs are addressed, where their development needs are addressed. And I mentioned earlier sort of the economic benefits of defense as well. And so again, I'm constantly trying to connect the dots. And I think that we need to help sometimes young people to make those connections for themselves as well.
Iain, was this the inspiration to start hosting London Defence Conference at King's College London?
Yes, it was a big part of it, actually.
I mean, we founded it in 2022 in the aftermath of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, rooted in an idea that this was the world changing, and that we are in the next, in the coming decades, going to have to think very differently about our security. And one of the things that we're most proud of with the London Defence Conference is that it has this partnership with King's at the heart of it, and that we also do, as part of the conference, integral to it, there's a Future Leaders Day, which is for industry, young professionals, people in Whitehall, and students coming together. About 300 for a day as part of the conference. That's the next generation on which we're all going to depend. I mean, to your point about how the young view this, I mean, someone getting older and thinking about it a lot, and worrying about that generation. I'm actually pretty optimistic about it, and I think that some of the polling can actually be a little bit deceptive on this. And if you watch focus groups with young people when they talk about this, the headline will say they wouldn't defend their country. But if you dig into it, the Times did some very interesting polling and focus groups on this recently. If you have a conversation and explain, and there's a dialogue, and then it becomes clear that the country could be at risk, and not just in a straightforward way. It's not just about, it's not about the prospect of invasion. It's about this really complex range of threats involving infrastructure, all the things we understand. Young people do respond and understand that, and get it. So, and I think the other thing is that politicians who've spent decades, not really, with a few honourable exceptions, not really talking about this, have an education role in a polite, non-patronising way with the electorate in general, but also particularly with younger people. And I think that the key point is, this is not about starting conflicts. This is about avoiding conflict. This is about deterrence. A term we've just got out of the habit of using for the last 30 years or so, when our policy went off in all sorts of different directions and we had what we thought was a peace dividend. This should be explained to people as being about as having sufficient resilience and force to deter adversaries, and that is not just about about some potential land war years down the line. But Ukraine is going through that at the moment. But a whole multiplicity of other threats, and so we need to be able to deter in every single domain. I'm confident that when that's explained to younger people, and that this is ultimately about defending our way of life and the way of life of our friends and allies in democratic societies, that is, I think, something to which they'll respond.
And if I can just come in support of that, I think that's one of the reasons why we are so proud of the Future Leaders Day, because being able to engage nearly 400 young professionals and students each year on serious conversations about defence is quite significant, and it has this effect that can be multiplied year on year. And often the rooms where these discussions happen, even international conferences and summits that are similar in ambition to what we are trying to do, these rooms tend to be quite inaccessible for young people to come and actually have those conversations, to be networking with those very senior and experienced professionals who are on the panels, to actually get a chance to share their views and their ideas and their creative ideas. And so it's very much our ambition to continue making sure that we facilitate that dialogue, but ideally even to take it further. So I would encourage defence companies and industry and others to think about defence research fellowships and actually funding researchers to do projects in this area. On our Future Leaders Day, we actually throughout all day 3 days of the conference, we showcase posters of the research that our doctoral candidates are doing on really cutting edge issues relevant to defence. But there could be more if investors also say, well, the conference is brilliant. It is a really important chance to have those conversations, but where can we take it further? Where can we fund the next generation of researchers on these issues? Where can we create bursaries? Where can we enable young people to actually do the kind of research that we need, whilst also empowering them in turn?
And they're brilliant. That's the key point. As someone whose background is media, which is full of skepticism and cynicism about these things, and now organising these conferences, that's the key thing. There are tons of brilliant next generation people working in going into Whitehall and public service, joining defence companies, driven with a clear understanding of what's at stake here. And I have to say, that's one of the great things about working with Kings on this. It's personally, very much restores your faith in the future of the country.
Can I ask both of you, how do we break out, though, especially in this country? You say, Hilary, there are some European countries that have conscription, others have strong sort of plebeian military culture. We've ended up with a bit of a warrior caste in the British military. And alongside it, let's face it, there are some defence companies you can't miss. Barrow, for example, Barrow is all now BAE, it's booming. But if I think about, my own area, the northwest England, I could take you to small northwest England towns. You turn off a street, you turn off another street, you go into a place where there are 3,000 people working on computer-aided design for submarines, and you wouldn't even know it was there. And the reason you don't know it's there is because no one wants you to know it's there. You can only work there if you're UK national, you're on List X. As we rearm, in the 30s, that wasn't the case. In the 30s, everyone knew we were rearming. Everyone knew there was a tank factory or a widget factory down the road that was making stuff for Spitfire. What culturally can we do to make those young people that we're attracting then become the ambassadors for a much wider engagement?
I mean, I face this problem because I run the MA National Security Studies at King's, and I'd love to take my students on a field trip, but we can't go to MI5, MI6. Your options are quite limited for a field trip. But the way we've tried to get around this is if you can't go to certain sites, it doesn't mean that you can't learn about different kinds of work. So that's why the conference is so important, to bring speakers from these places to come and talk about it. But it should be a sustained effort over the course of the year. So we can do hackathons, we can come with problems, and we can also, not in the ones that are really in secret sites, but many companies could take a short-term intern to actually come in and learn about what the company does, and also to think about defense-themed modules at university. So the MOD sets certain problems that students on a module we run called Hacking for Defense. They spend a year resolving these kinds of, thinking about these problems. And university students are really keen to work on things that have real world impact. That's why they come and study these kinds of programs. But it doesn't have to only be in the Department of War Studies, which seems like the natural choice. But you could go to engineering departments. You could go to almost any kind of department, even philosophy departments. You could go to think about some of the ethical questions or some of the complex problems. And I think it's about really improving these links between government, industry, and academia, which is exactly why we bring these three groups together to the conference, because you need to have that dialogue going on.
Iain, so the topic for this year is alliances. Could you please elaborate a bit more on why this choice this year?
Well, alongside what we've just described, which is the Future Leaders Day, there are 2 days of the conference where we gather together leaders, policymakers, visiting delegations. Crucial difference with our conference is we are a conference exclusively of friendly countries. So we're a gathering of allies, but not necessarily formal allies, friends, countries who broadly wish each other well, and we gather them for 2 days, those international delegations, and discuss the state of the world. The theme this year, appropriately enough, is alliances. And it's an attempt to get to the bottom of how should we think about alliances nowadays. Obviously, the world has been shaken and is undergoing enormous amounts of change in terms of the international system. So what does that mean in practice? What is NATO going to look like? There's a brilliant paper which I heartily recommend to everyone by Camille Grand from the Belfer Centre and various other colleagues back in February, which is about building the European pillar of NATO. And it's the first practical attempt I've seen to try and explain what does NATO look like, with America still engaged, but based on an understanding that over the medium term, America is drawing down and switching its attention strategically to the Pacific. So there's that, and I think there's despair is not, and despair and hope are not a strategy. We actually need a plan on making the European pillar of NATO stronger, and we all know what that means. That means heavy lift, increased investment in intelligence, more of everything, to show to the Americans that Europe is taking this seriously. And then what does it mean for JEF, Joint Expeditionary Force, which is a subject which we've been very interested in the conference since it started. And then there's the AUKUS relationship. And then countries like Japan, who are very interested in the conference and always send delegations. And we'll have a very big American presence this year at the conference. A lot of interest in the US. I'm off to DC shortly and to field those requests. So we'll have a big American component, but within that, we'll also be talking about the future of nuclear. We'll be talking about shadow war, which is everything from seabed to space and in between, and cyber and biology, which is increasingly going to be a major theme in this field. And we'll have expert panels interspersed with, as we've had in previous years, visiting leaders and people from friendly countries.
Do we think we know where the United Kingdom thinks it is amid this pattern of alliances? As you say, I mean, I don't see Jeff constantly talked about in UK security circles, and I'm a big supporter of of the idea of Jeff. And as we know, the Baltics and the Nordics are also very keen on it. Likewise, do we think the UK, even as we speak, knows exactly where it is and should be positioned within the coalition of the willing around Ukraine? I don't know whether either of you have got views on that.
Personally, I think that the UK position is broadly correct in terms of the context of the last 2 or 3 months, which I think it makes perfect sense to. The reality is the UK has a very particular relationship with the United States for reasons we all understand on intelligence and our history and sort of cultural bond. So doing everything possible to maintain and develop that relationship in circumstances which have obviously changed. Simultaneously, as one of the 2 bigger defence powers in Europe, is going to play a leading role in whatever comes next in terms of the reform of NATO, the European pillar question that I described, and then that's complicated and really not straightforward, trying to develop or be alongside whatever the European Union is planning to do on procurement. And then, of course, it has absolutely critical alliances like Australia to think about as well. So I don't think there is a single position that can be delivered either as a soundbite or as an hour-long speech saying this is how you view the world. I think it's partly about improvisation with a situation which is changing very fast.
It's just hard for the public to read. That's when you see Mark Carney making a very strong statement of pushback to Donald Trump over the weekend. Then you see the Foreign Minister of Denmark doing likewise. So you get 2 very strong public, tweeted out, TikToked out, and then you get us. We are, as you say, quite rightly, trying to build a bridge with the USA, going right back to Ernest Bevin. That's been what Labour politicians are basically trained to do. How does that play out, for example, with a young undergraduate at King's turns up and says, well, what's my role in the world? What are we here to do? Make friends with the Americans? Or listen to our Canadian allies who are saying sort of quite strong pushback themes towards Trump?
I think it comes again with this recognition of the complexity of the world, and that you stand up on things that really challenge core values, especially if the USSR says it's supposed to be defending a liberal international order, and you stand up for behaviors that undermine this, because otherwise if the choice becomes between multiple illiberal orders, then how can you say you're defending that? But there's also a need to be pragmatic, and the clout and the economic power and the military expertise and all of that the US wields is not going away at all. And we do need to work with American partners, even if the style of diplomacy is one that we need to begin to understand in a more transactional way, as it's coming from somebody who's more business-minded. And that's something we see in other places as well. I mean, much of China's aid comes out of the Ministry of Trade. So there is, actually, if we think about it, many states in the world act in a way where you need to try to show that you're speaking to their interests as well. I think to come on the question that you asked earlier, I think, again, it's not about seeing either or. I think the UK remains very strong on its traditional partnership and alliances. But you talk about things like the JEF, and I think these kinds of models, which are smaller and operationally quicker to deploy and so on, are important for the kind of web of capability that we can use. So during COVID-19, we saw a lot of these smaller groupings popping up to address different kinds of issues. And these were not, so there was one that Austria led where Sebastian Kurz at the time was interviewed, and he said, well, it's not an alternative to the UN and the WHO, but we need these smaller groups to be a bit more agile at the moment. And he said there's a space for both as well. And so I think it's about thinking about what kinds of models work in different situations. I don't think any of our undergraduates would doubt that where the UK stands in terms of its very traditional partners, all the countries that you just mentioned. But I think it's also about reinforcing to everybody the importance of different kinds of partners. So my area of expertise is the security of small states. And you mentioned the Baltics, where there is a lot of niche expertise that we can draw on, because often when you're smaller, you tend to specialize rather than try and do the entire menu of things that states do. So the NATO Center of Excellence on Cyber is in Estonia. The NATO Center of Excellence on Hybrid Threats is in Finland. The Center of Excellence on Strategic Communication is in Latvia. So how can we work with these partners to also learn ourselves, and that we think about the relationship as a two-way street? And so you talked about conscription and societal resilience. You used the word resilience a few times. I mean, Finland has an amazing model of whole of society comprehensive security, where they work not only with defense industry and government, but also with all of society. And at their monthly security committee, you have representations from industry, from NGOs and so on, that really work together to think about the whole of society approach. So what can we learn from there to also enact in our own society to get people more on board with thinking about defense issues? And I'd say the last two examples I'd give is, even as our attention is very much focused eastward and even, I guess, out to the Indo-Pacific, the height of the Cold War, we're also reminded that there's no peace in Europe without peace in the Mediterranean. And so to keep building on our partnership with southern Mediterranean countries as well, so that we don't lose sight of where challenges might come from in the future. And also, I mean, the UK has this amazing resource of the Commonwealth, which gives us an avenue that stretches into the Indo-Pacific. We're not just tilting there in the last few years. We've been there a very long time. We have a special partnership with India because of it, and other smaller states as well. And so I think this is a resource that the UK can start thinking about more for defense purposes as well, where it hasn't traditionally been one of the partnerships that's thought of.
And underpinning the London Defence Conference is a notion that everything is connected. I'm a great fan of Halford Mackinder, the inventor of geopolitics, geographer, and amazing thinker about how the world knits together. And although I'm particularly focused at the moment on the Baltic, because of the threat, and that the Baltic is connected, for obvious reasons, to the High North, which is connected to the Arctic. The Baltic is a gateway to the North Atlantic, which is originally, and has for centuries been, a major core part of the British mission, has been to be the guardian of North Atlantic security on our side of the Atlantic. And then you go down through the Med, as Hilary mentioned. Well, the Mediterranean is only 120 odd kilometers from the Indo-Pacific, which we shouldn't forget begins at the bottom of the Suez Canal. And look at where the British are represented with a base in Bahrain, working with the American Fifth Fleet, and then that stretches across. It takes you across into a whole other sphere. Or you go round and over the top. Pretty soon you're into China's sphere of interest, and then round the corner and you're into Japan's space, which obviously then brings in the Australians. So the idea of these just being discrete, as in separate theatres that we can think about them in isolation, I think is Mackinder was absolutely right. That's wrong. And we might at the moment have to put a lot more into Northern Europe and Northern European NATO for obvious reasons, just because of the proximity of the threat. But we shouldn't lose sight of that interconnectedness.
And that's where, again, like learning from working in true partnerships shows there's a lot that UK can learn from the experience of the Nordics in the High North and operating there, and where we can really build strong partnerships from learning on both sides. But I do think that to bring this full circle back to the financing question, where all the money is coming from, because these theaters are all so interconnected, I do have some concerns about, you know, these significant cuts to aid funding that are coming from, that the US sort of started and everybody else seems to have followed suit, because the largest aid donor after the US that is poised to step into the space is China. That's who many countries in the Indo-Pacific and Africa and so on are going to.
And not just there. I mean, Southern Europe, the Balkans,
Exactly.
the Chinese are already in there,
Mopping
up schools, hospitals that the Americans have defunded.
And the model of China is to do it with loans. And so therefore there is a risk of what are the conditions of the debt going to be like. And so both in that case, but also in the more human security side of things, if we remember that insecurity might cause movement or might cause problems that have spillover effects elsewhere, I don't think I think it's a mistake to not recognize how aid can tackle some of the root causes that lead to some of the symptoms that then defense must contend with. And so I do think we need to be thinking really hard about the model of where defense funding comes from, so that it's not going to be at the entire expense of the aid budget as well.
It's really fascinating conversation today, and we are very much looking forward to continuing this discussion at the London Defence Conference, which is taking place this year in May on the 9th, the 10th.
8th, 9th,
well,
10th.
Iain knows better.
Which coincides with VE Day 80th
That's right.
anniversary. Yep.
That's right.
Which is an amazing opportunity for all of us in the defence and security space to tell a story.
Yeah, precisely.
Indeed. And on that note, I would like to thank our guests today, Iain, Martin and Hilary Briffa, for joining us to have this conversation. And of course, well, Paul, as always, thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure.
And we thank all our listeners, and thank you for listening to Defence Talk Securing a Key Advantage, brought to you by the ADS Group and sponsored by BAE Systems. You can listen to all our past and upcoming episodes on Britain's World and on our online magazine. Please visit www.britain'sworld.org.uk/defence talks. Thank you so much, and until next time.